All right, so now we're in section 4 of this. We did our first 3 sections before the break, so it's been quite a while. But if you will remember, the last thing we talked about was Hitler's fateful decision to invade Russia in what was known as Operation Barbarossa. It was really his first major mistake, and then from here on out, we're going to turn our attention to the rest of World War II. But really the focus is going to be on the U.S. and what's going on in the U.S. And what's going to be our first. That's what we're going to focus on here. And then we're going to talk about the atrocities of the Holocaust, and then the rest of the European theater, and the Pacific War, and then the United States joining and then dropping the bombs, stuff like that. So, of course, that's what we're going to kind of cover here. Now, Pearl Harbor was a moment of obvious decision-making that we went into with the United States, where basically we had to make a tough choice. Are we going to join World War II or not? And we know that the Japanese sneak attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. Of course, it was an act of war, so FDR is going to declare war, ask for a declaration of war on Japan. Well, Japan and Germany were allies, so when we declare war on Japan, Germany declares war on us on December 9th. And so we basically end up with no choice but to join in its entirety and declare war on Germany as well. Now, believe it or not, following Pearl Harbor, it was not a unanimous vote to declare war on Japan, which is kind of crazy. You know, Congress, they go to Congress and they're like, we want to declare war. And Congress has to vote on it. And the vote was 477 to 1. Yeah. One person voted against it, which is kind of crazy. It was a woman. I'm just kidding. No, it was a woman, though, named Jeannette Rankin. She was a congresswoman from Montana, and she was an avid pacifist. She believed in nonviolence entirely, not like just, oh, you know, we should be nice to each other. She truly believed in under no circumstances violence the answer. So in reality, her vote against going to war was kind of admirable in that even in the face of Pearl Harbor, she votes against going to war. So at least she stood by her convictions. And so by, having a dissenting vote, which I kind of, in all reality, I kind of admire quite a bit, because when every other member of both houses of Congress vote in favor of it, and you're the only person who stands alone and says, well, I'm a pacifist, and I don't vote for that, and I don't ever believe under any circumstance, okay, that's admirable in reality. There were other men who were like Quakers and pacifists in Congress that still voted for war. So in reality, she was kind of more tied to her beliefs than even the men that, quote unquote, shared her beliefs were. And so again, Japan, we declare war on them. The U.S. is not going to come up with its overall strategy, out of thin air. Obviously, we had been building up our military forces to some extent, but we hadn't trained people yet, because remember, we had been isolated and we need to have this big giant army. We had cranked up the war machine to some extent, but not anywhere close to what we would have to do to be actually ready for war. So they start enlisting people. They start trying to get people into the army. Second, they want to take out the German U-boats in order to win control of the Atlantic, because now that we're in the war, how are we going to get all of our troops to Europe? Obviously, the easiest way to do that is by boat, but if we put the entire U.S. Army on a boat and try and sail it across the Atlantic, and the German U-boats sink all of our boats, we're just going to be sending guys to the slaughter, right? So we've got to take control of the Atlantic. Then we're going to wipe out Hitler, and then we're going to try and focus on the Pacific. And so that's really kind of what we're focusing on here is kind of the strategy that we go about using. And then also, how does this affect American culture? Through marketing and advertisements. How are they going to get these different ethnic groups that are in the United States to all get behind World War II? And so we're going to focus on that, the early part of the war here, and the U.S. involvement. So war mobilization is going to create hundreds of thousands of jobs. It's basically going to end unemployment overnight. Now remember, the unemployment, there was about 16.3 million Americans that are going to basically end up entering the armed forces during World War II. 16.3 million Americans. All those people that needed jobs and all that stuff, guess what? They got a job. Shoot the Germans, right? That included even 330,000 women. And so even women, as nurses and secretaries and stuff like that, no combat roles for women. And that's going to take all the way until really the 90s almost, right? Before we see women in combat roles. We still don't, I guess, I'm not 100% sure on this. I could be wrong. I want to say that there was a woman that passed special forces training possibly, but in the name of equity, it was not the same standards that the men had to pass. So women are just not in the same combat roles all the way up until basically today, essentially. But women were allowed to join, like I said, as support personnel, as nurses, and stuff like that, translators, lots of translators. And so we think about, massive population movement is going to end up happening. By the end of the war, a third of the population was middle class. They owned a house, a car, numerous consumer products. Mass production kicks back up. American industrialism really reignites, kind of how it was back in the early 20s, now that there's a desire and the government is the one spending the money on goods. And so, it's kind of interesting to kind of think about the role that the government really does play in sparking the economy back up if it's done in the right way. Giving money to people doesn't seem to work. Government buying goods does seem to work. So take that how you want. But merchant ship production went from 17 weeks to make a merchant vessel like a troop transport or a supply transport vessel. Prior to World War II, it was taking us 17 weeks to make them. All of a sudden, we're like, hey, we need to rebuild our Navy. We just lost our whole dadgum Navy in Pearl Harbor. We need to make ships faster. We get that down to about 2 weeks. We're cranking out warships and troop transports every 2 weeks. Henry Ford converts his automobile factories into aircraft factories, and they start producing bombers. And bombs begin being produced at an unprecedented level as well. The U.S. ends up building more than 300,000 airplanes, 76,000 ships, 86,000 tanks within about a 2-3 year stretch. That's a lot of building stuff. And if you think about all the materials needed to build those things like rubber and gasoline, textiles, because the Army, they need rations, they need all these things, they need, clothes, they need uniforms. And so they start rationing textiles. And it's actually during this time that a very iconic piece of outerwear, swimwear gets invented, because prior to this, there was only one-piece bathing suits for women. And because they were looking at women and going, do y'all really need, all that material? How about we just cut it here and cut it here, and then we'll use that material to put clothes on soldiers, and thus the bikini was formed. That's a true story. That's why it was a necessity from World War II that the bikini was actually made so that the middle section of cloth could be saved and used for parachutes and all kinds of things. And so, it's really becomes a total cultural movement by the end of the war. There's a ton of outcomes on this, but like we said, pretty much everybody is middle class by the end of World War II. So economically, it's very beneficial to America that we actually end up going to war. Then there's war in the popular culture, and people start to celebrate the war effort to help mobilize Americans. Comic book authors and artists start to make their heroes ones that are going to, old and new heroes that are going to be fighting the war. You end up with people like Captain America, right? That is created during this time frame, kind of getting people to be patriotic and join the war force. You know, you see here Captain America is he's going in there, he's about to slap the Nazis and Adolf Hitler with his shield, and even Superman, who wears, red and blue and kind of represented, look, he's on top of a Japanese airplane and he's about to punch this dude in the face. Okay. Why don't you just shoot him with your heat vision? But whatever. It seems unnecessary. Also, why didn't he just fly through the plane and crash it? I don't understand. But obviously, this is trying to get people to show, like, hey, even superheroes are on America's side here. And, there are some that are pretty cringeworthy and, some that are fairly neutral. You have some that, encourage the role of women, like Rosie the Riveter here. She plays a very key component in, mobilizing women to go into the workforce. And it's kind of, something that definitely strikes at the heart of what is going on in the United States. If you notice here, Rosie, she's got her sleeves rolled up. She's about to go to work, but she's still got makeup on. So you can be pretty and go to work. So don't think you shouldn't still be pretty, ladies. Just, go to work also. 300,000 women, as we said, served in the Army. They would launch this massive campaign to recruit women for the war industries because all the men had gone off to war. And so you're going to end up needing these women to go and join the workforce. 1944, women accounted for 36% of the workforce, of the war industry workforce, by, with about midpoint of the war for us. So they're voting, they're now involved in industry, and that's going to lead to their political involvement growing post-World War II. Sometimes from your perspective, from our perspective today, with our historical context, this can kind of seem a little sexist, but this lady's going, hey, I found the job where I fit best. And obviously, it's a secretary, which, basically saying, like, women should be secretaries, which seems, again, sexist to us, but this was unimaginable even before this, because they wouldn't have even advertised these jobs for women at all. So it does provide an avenue to helping women, get into those workspaces and actually get involved in a lot of different ways throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. You end up with the Office of Censorship, and their job is to kind of suppress information that they think is vital or detrimental to the war effort. This is pretty shaky ground when it comes to the First Amendment. You're basically saying we can curtail and stop your free speech because we disagree, or we don't want you to give away certain tactics. And so essentially, they're basically putting out propaganda at a high rate. You have Hitler and the Japanese here. They're looking like, oh, we're going to take over America. They've got their eyes on America, right? And of course, obviously, Hitler does need to be stopped, and what the Japanese did to Pearl Harbor was terrible, and what they were doing to the Chinese is unbelievable. But, it was pretty bad. Then you have the Office of War Information, again, vilify the enemy, make this look like it's good versus evil, so that it's us versus them. Censorship point, we can talk about these here. It says, what are you going to do? Stay on the job until every murdering Jap is wiped out. Wow. They're playing on this idea that the Japanese were just murdering prisoners of war, which we do know about the Bataan Death March, where they marched the prisoners of war from the Philippines. They marched them to camps, and along that march, like 5,000 people died. They torture them, they kill them, and it's very uncomfortable to kind of see, but the idea is make the Japanese seem terrible. If the more racial epithets that we can throw at them, the more we can put them down, the more we can make them seem less than human, the better. Because then it's us versus them. This is a very sad one. This is one where they're saying, hey, if you're if you find out that your hubby is doing, a special operation, don't say anything. You don't know where the spies are. And there were spies that were trying to get information about U.S. troop movements. And this is basically like careless talk got there first. So basically like telling people like, don't talk about where your significant other is because if the enemy finds out, they'll kill him. So, guilt trip people into not talking about the war. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Hitler does get co-opted pretty much for every single cause, though. Like, if you wanted to just make something a bad thing, you just put Hitler's face on it. So basically, every single group that, underage drinking, Hitler drinks underage. It's called, the whole idea is like, he was like, oh, you like soccer? You're a terrorist. Or he's like, that became popular back in like the early mid-2000s. It's like, what are you, a terrorist? Right? Like, what are you, Al-Qaeda? Right? Like, what are you, ISIS? Right? Like, it's the same idea, but basically, like, they did it with Hitler. But some of the ones that they used were kind of weird. Like, if you're giving it up, you're going steady with Hitler. So, like an abstinence group, they're basically saying, ladies, Nazis have sex before they're married. Don't be a Nazi, right? Like quite literally every single group in the United States says stay pure, save it for marriage. A reminder from the Coalition of Abstinence Education, which is insane that even they are like, you should abstain from marriage. Hitler doesn't care if you do. He's the devil, right? And so like pretty awkward, right? That they're just no shame whatsoever. Don't put out. That's what Hitler wants. So I just thought that's pretty funny, actually, to be completely honest. We talked about women. Let's talk about the minorities because they play a pretty amazing role in World War II, and I don't think it gets discussed enough. And we're going to really hone in on a particular incident in a group of soldiers, and they are going to launch what's known as the WWII campaign. And it's launched by like the Tuskegee Airmen. The WWII campaign is launched in response to the V for Victory slogan that the government was saying. And so there, you might have seen like there's like a old photograph of like Winston Churchill giving the peace sign or whatever, but it's not. He's saying V for Victory, right? Like doing like this was originally like V for Victory. And so he wasn't like being like, peace, everybody, peace to the world. No, he was like, kick the piss out of the Nazis. Like, that's really what he was saying there. And so the African-American groups were kind of like, no, double V. V for victory in Europe and at home. Because they see their opportunity to show the rest of the world that they are just as capable and just as courageous and just as committed to America as white people were, particularly in the Jim Crow South, where everything is segregated because people think, oh, white people are just smarter or better or more evolved or whatever than black people. Black people are going, no, this is our chance to show them that we are just as much as they are. And FDR initially, he goes on to ban discrimination in the war industries. So if you own a bomb factory, you don't get to just not hire black people because we need everybody that can working in the bomb factories. So African Americans are actually going to be paid the same wages as white workers during this time. Again, the Tuskegee Airmen, there are about 1 million African Americans that serve in the war, mostly in segregated units, because they don't want them fighting on the front lines. They thought, oh, they're better suited to be in the back there doing support roles. Very racist. And I think that it's important to tell the whole story, because there's, a lot of these African American groups are extremely involved in trying to become important participants in the war effort. Most famous of them, I would say, was the Tuskegee Airmen, the 99th Fighter Squadron. They are the first African Americans that are allowed to fly planes in the armed services. People thought, they're not capable, they're not smart enough, they're not coordinated enough to fly planes. If only they had, you know, a time capsule that they could have jumped forward and seen, you know, today, they would have felt really stupid. Not coordinated enough. My gosh. Watch the Olympics, please. Right. They can windmill dunk into the airplane and fly and shoot 40 Nazis. Like, it's absolute insanity, like the reasoning that they kept black people out of the armed services and from doing certain jobs. So these guys, you know, they fight for their right to go and fly airplanes, and they get well trained in Tuskegee, Alabama, and they become basically one of the most successful squadrons in the entire armed forces. In fact, they get the terrible jobs of escorting the big giant bomber planes. And so basically, these bomber planes, you know, they're very vulnerable. They don't have very good maneuvering. They're very heavy. They're very large. And so you would send these airplanes with them to try and defend them from, like, you know, the fast planes that would come and shoot them down, or from ground cover or ground fire. And so, like, the average bomber, the kind of rule was if you made 20 bombing runs successfully, then you got to retire. Like, you didn't have to do it anymore because it was so dangerous. But, like, only like 20% of all bombers in World War II got to 20. Like, the casualty rate was unbelievable. So the Tuskegee Airmen get sent, because it's a very deadly job, to go guard these big bombers. They, in their entire war effort, never had a single bomber that they were protecting go down, get shot down. Not one. Which is unbelievable when you think about how many were shot down. And there is a Hollywood movie that you may or may not have seen about the Tuskegee Airmen. It's called Red Tails. Ever heard of it? No? Anyways, they really do start to show that, you know, African Americans are capable and that they love their country, they're patriotic, and this does play into their favor when they get back. Although in the South it's a little more difficult, and you're still going to have to go through the civil rights movement and all of that to get to where they believe they should be. But they certainly put their name out there and kind of disprove some of the cowardly ideas and stuff like that that had been surrounding them. Okay. Now, the Section 5 here that we're going to cover is probably the heaviest topic of the semester, saddest, probably hardest to talk about. It's kind of hard to do any real justice to the terrible events. There's no words for how awful the Holocaust was, you know, and you still have, like I said, the Asian Holocaust, and we don't get a lot of press about that, but it's almost impossible to put into words how terrible this was. But we're going to just kind of talk about it. The first thing, though, you do need to understand that the Holocaust is terrible, yes. What we also did was terrible, which we also kind of put people not in concentration camps where we were trying to kill them, but we put them in internment camps. We built these camps for the Japanese Americans in the United States. President Roosevelt issued something called Executive Order 9066. Basically, from 1942 to 1945, it was the policy of the U.S. government that if you were of Japanese descent, that you would be taken from your homes and put into a camp. Yeah. No trial, no nothing. Oh, you're Japanese? Come with us. What about my dog? We don't care. What about my stuff? Grab what you need. You're coming with us. You're going to live in this camp for as long as we want you to. They built like schools and just basically made them live there. And I don't know that anybody like died directly. Like, we weren't trying to kill them, but we definitely just imprisoned them. It was a prison camp, essentially. And so, like, in the middle of the desert, like, we just put them out there, and they're like, why? Well, you're Japanese. So? Well, you know, Japanese people really love Japan, and we don't know if you're a spy, and it's too hard to figure out if you're a spy, so we're just going to lock all of you up, which is kind of crazy. And so it affected the lives of about 117,000 Japanese Americans. The majority of them were American citizens. You know, Mexico enacted its own version of this, but it only affected like 2,200 because Japanese people were like, we're not living in Mexico. I'm just saying. But throughout South America, you know, people start to take things out on people of Japanese descent. And so we have these very troubling camps that we built. Basically, Japanese were guilty by ethnic association, you know, and it wasn't even, you didn't even, like, if you were 1/16th Japanese to the camp, like if one of your grandparents was Japanese, or, yeah, great-grandparents, I don't know. If one of your great-grandparents was Japanese, like, that's not, basically, lots and lots of people, they're trying to avoid espionage, but certainly it's a violation of human rights. Violence did occur within those camps because people didn't want to be imprisoned for no reason, but this is one of them. The Japanese basically took it in stride, though, even though they had to live in essentially horse stalls, or cow sheds or whatever, you know, these kind of portable buildings. One of these camps was where the Pacific International Livestock Exposition Facility was. So literally where cows, they put them in cow stalls. And again, you can kind of, this is one of those camps. It was in California, I believe. And if you look at this picture here, it might be slightly recognizable to you. I think today they've actually changed it but for a long time, if you have like an old DVD or something, if you made this gold and shimmering and then flipping, yeah, this is, they took this internment camp and turned it into the Warner Brothers lot, the Warner Brothers studio lot. So they took a lot of these buildings afterwards and turned that into that. So, yeah, you know, there you go. The Japanese atrocities are pretty bad. You know, they used everybody that they captured as prisoners and slave labor, and they took all the women and basically turned them, they put them in military brothels. So basically, any women that they captured in China, they would take them and just hand them to the men in the army and be like, use them till they're dead. Literally. Like, you'd send 3 or 4 women to a camp of several hundred soldiers and just be like, when they're dead, stop. Or don't, whatever. Like, yeah, they were it's pretty bad. That's not hyperbole. They just did that. So, they mistreated POWs in vast numbers. Obviously, the real problem was that Japanese had something called the Bushido Code of the samurai, which basically was the honor code. And part of the honor code was that, like, you never give up, you never surrender. So basically, the entire idea was that if you surrender, you're like a dog. Like, only dogs surrender. Like, real men, real humans are supposed to fight to the death. And so anybody who surrendered was instantly considered like less than human. So they didn't even feel bad about treating them bad because their honor code said, you're not even a human. You gave up. You should have fought to the death. Like, they wouldn't even surrender, right? You have the whole ceremonial suicide and stuff that the Japanese would do because it was better to just die than to give up. You had shame. It was shameful to give up. And so they didn't even care. They just, if you gave up, you're worthless trash. And it was really, really awful. The historical estimates of the number of deaths from Japanese war crimes range anywhere from 3 million to 14 million. We don't really know because they just killed people. But 14 million they didn't keep records like the Nazis did, because the Nazis, remember, they're trying to make sure they eradicate Jews. So they're trying to keep track of how many Jews they killed, because they look at the census beforehand and know how many they started with, so they've got to make sure they kill them all. The Japanese were like, we don't care, we're just going to kill you, right? But definitely in the probably double-digit millions, just in awful, terrible ways. And you can find horrific black and white photos online of experiments that they did, how much pain does it take for someone to die? If you cut someone open and take their intestines out, can they still feel it? Like crazy stuff, like the Nazis did also, just terrible, But of course, we have the Nazis here, Heinrich Himmler, Adolf Eichmann, and Joseph Mengele are some of the worst humans that have ever lived. Adolf Eichmann was the head of the Office of Jewish Affairs, which is kind of a terrible term, because the head of Office of Jewish Affairs, the only Jewish affairs that he was the head of was the extermination of the Jews. Mengele was he did medical experimentation on Jews, including, how long can a newborn baby survive without its mother's milk? Literally just let it starve to death and see how long it takes. He was the one that came up with the idea of the gas chambers at Auschwitz. But obviously, all these people, they're definitely burning in hell. So, yeah, just saying. I think that's fair. Now, the Nazis would determine who needed to be locked up in prison and in camps through different insignias. You had, political dissidents. You had, the blue was immigrants, right? The purple was kind of like Bible students who they disagreed with, you had politicians, homosexuals, all different kinds of people that they just didn't like, and then they kind of ranked them, and then they started with the Jews first, and then you had to wear the second triangle behind there, like the Star of David. And so, it's pretty crazy, and then they would just kind of mark you as undesirable and round you up, and then, kill you. So, it's pretty awful. Now, the Holocaust really begins, with these SS action squads that begin mass murders of undesirables. They would round them up and shoot them on the spot and then put them in a pit with other dead bodies. And basically, they figured out pretty quick, this is not very efficient. We got a lot of people to kill, millions and millions of people that we got to shoot. That's a lot of bullets. We really need those to shoot, the people in Britain and France. We don't really need to be wasting all these bullets. Plus, it takes a long time, then we got to get rid of the bodies. So they come up with the final solution where they're basically going to take them to camps and then put them in gas chambers and then turn the gas on and then suffocate them with something called Zyklon B, which is kind of like carbon monoxide, and then burn the bodies. They burned the bodies so much that, at Auschwitz, that there were towns that, for months, it essentially snowed ash from the bodies, in July. So, and then when the U.S. and the Russians get there, they're like, you can't tell me you didn't know this was going on out here. And they're like, oh, we didn't know. And they're like, oh, yeah, it's snowing in July. Yeah, surely you didn't know, right? Of course you knew. You knew what was going on. You just didn't want to do anything about it. But again, these concentration camps were pretty crazy. There's a crazy movie that's about, when they decide to actually kill the Jews, with the gas chambers. I've watched it a couple times just because it's so insane. This idea of, what's it called? I don't know if it's called, The Final Solution or something like that. But basically, it's like basically, what was the meeting like where all the people in the Nazi government got together and decided, oh, we're just going to gas them to death, right? Like, it's pretty crazy. You have these uniform, right? Like, this is what their tag looked like, and they put them in these striped pajama-looking things, and there's actually a movie about that also, like The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, where you have like the one kid who's like, he's the son of a high-ranking official in the camp, and then like the other kid, he's like in the camp, and they like kind of communicate through the fence, and then one day he doesn't anymore. I mean, it's very sad, right? It's very terrible, these first-hand accounts. You have women like Irene Fogelvice, I believe. She lived in Czechoslovakia at the outbreak of World War II. It was one of the first places that the Nazis conquered. She recounted her story in an article in The Guardian. She was holding up a photo of her family here that she had been trying to find all these years later. And I'll kind of read some of this to you, but it's really important to understand the real, perspective of the people who went through this. It's kind of shocking and appalling. And the photos are, you look at the photos and you hear someone's firsthand account and you really understand, like, this really happened. Like, the people out there that are like, oh, the Holocaust didn't really happen. Those people, punch them in the face. They're idiots. And then you'd be like, that didn't really happen. And then see what they say. Says, imagine 3 generations of your family have lived in the same house, in the same town. They've struggled to raise a family, to put kids through school. You have all your friends and family. All of a sudden, you were told to leave it all and walk out with a single suitcase. I remember the night of the packing very well. Things went into a suitcase. My mother filled it with food that she could cook and warm clothes and bedding, and it was full. Plus, we took a watch, some earrings, and a wedding ring with us to exchange for food if necessary. The next day, my father was forced to hand over all his remaining money to a delegation that included the mayor and school principal as they rounded us up into town hall. All of this is by Nazi law, perfectly right by the law. They had been absolutely unaware that such a place as we had been unaware of such a place that this could happen. It was a stunning reversal of life. My father had given up to live, and we couldn't emphasize how utterly scary it was to see your fellow human beings that you'd grown up with treating you this way. I could not understand what we had done to deserve this. And then she goes on to talk about that her father surveyed the scene and took the train on the right. And they get some prisoners and uniform workers and thought, okay, that's for the work camp, that's good. If we're going to go work, we're not going to be killed, because they had heard a lot of stories from Poland about mass shootings of Jews being taken into the forest and shot. So now it seemed like there was a system where, victims are going to be taken to a camp to work. Great, we're going to go to a work camp, And that's what she's thinking as a child. She doesn't realize that, this is a carefully orchestrated plan of genocide. So she said we couldn't have imagined that they would kill little children until we realized that killing children was their primary goal, to prevent any new generations from being born. And again, that was their primary goal. Because desperate people will always look to find some sign of hope, we thought to ourselves, even if we have to work, at least we'll see each other occasionally. To count on people normal's perception of things, thinking we were going to a work camp, thinking that you could go and take a shower when in fact you were going to the gas chamber. Ultimately, when we arrived, as I found out later, this was a usual story. And not to us at the time, our family was torn apart on the platform on arrival. My sister Serena was chosen for slave labor. My mother and younger children were sent off to one side, my father and 16-year-old brother to the other. I held tightly to the hand of my 12-year-old sister. For an instant, I was mistaken for being older than I probably was. I was wearing a headscarf that my mother had given me, and my sister was sent with my mother while I went to the opposite direction. That was the first chance I had to survive. Unbeknownst to any of us, at the time, Nazi soldiers had been asked to make photographic documents of the deportation of Jews at the moment they got off the train as they entered the bathhouse. So they took their clothes off, they took a picture as they were being separated, which is what she has here, that this is her trying to hold on to her sister as they're being separated. So she ends up being on the work side. Her mother, her infant baby sister, her other little sister, her dad and brother, they all get sent immediately to the gas chamber. You know, and so, yeah, it's pretty crazy. She says, this is, another picture we discovered is my family waiting in line for the gas chamber. So they found that. This is her family over here. She said that's her mother and dad, or mom and sister standing in line to go into the gas chamber. They told them, oh, we're going to give you a shower to get all the lice off, and then they gas them. Yeah. She said she was not able to find her mother. She spent hours looking and never did. It took her about 45 years to even find pictures of them. Said within about a half an hour, although she didn't know it, within a half an hour, her entire family had likely been gassed and turned into ash. So just imagine that. The Russians eventually came, and eventually they set these people free. But unfortunately, from this lady's hometown, there was about 100 people in her hometown. At the end, they only found about 10 people that survived. Her and her sister, and then 8 other people. No parent-child pair survived. So, yeah, it was pretty terrible. Yeah. About 6 million Jews were killed or worked to death, 5 million civilians, 3.5 million Russian POWs. Every German city had slave laborers during the war. And the question becomes, why didn't the Allied powers just bomb the Germany death camps or the railroads leading to them? And the real answer to that is, well, they didn't really know. They didn't want to kill the people they were trying to save. The Allies kind of knew some of this was happening, not to the extent that it was, but unfortunately, yeah, pretty terrible. And you can kind of see a map here of all the different camps that were set up throughout Germany and Poland and Czechoslovakia. Like, these were all major concentration camps that were set up. They sent them all over the place. And so I'm glad those stupid Nazis are dead. The end.